Leadership. It's one of those words we think we understand. But what if the most powerful leaders in history weren't the ones giving orders from golden thrones, but the ones quietly serving others? Today, we're exploring a 1400-year-old teaching that completely redefines what it means to lead.
You know, that's such an intriguing perspective, especially when we look at how leadership is typically portrayed in our society. It's usually all about authority, power, and being at the top of the hierarchy.
Well, this hadith we are discussing today actually turns that entire concept upside down. It states, the master of a people is their servant. And what's fascinating is how this principle has played out throughout history.
Could you break down what that actually means in practice? Because it seems almost paradoxical at first glance.
So here's what's really interesting. In Arabic, the word for leader implies someone who guides and directs. But this hadith connects it directly to service. Think about it like this. Imagine you have two types of parents. One demands their children serve them, while the other dedicates themselves to nurturing their children's growth and well-being.
That's such a powerful analogy. And it reminds me of the historical example you mentioned earlier, the contrast between Pharaoh and Dhul Qarnayn. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely fascinating comparison. So you've got Pharaoh, who exemplified toxic leadership, demanding worship, forcing millions to build monuments to his glory, hoarding resources for himself. He literally expected an entire civilization to serve his ego.
And how did that work out for society under his rule?
Well, historical records show it led to massive inequality, social unrest, and ultimately collapse. But then you have this remarkable counterexample with Dulkarnain, who traveled vast distances and used his power and resources to help communities in need.
You know what strikes me about that story? He didn't just delegate the work. He actually got involved in the physical labor of building that protective barrier. That's real servant leadership in action.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how this principle shows up in modern research on effective leadership. Studies have shown that companies with servant leader CEOs tend to have higher employee satisfaction, better retention rates, and even stronger financial performance.
That makes me think about how this applies beyond just formal leadership positions. Could you speak to that aspect?
That's actually one of the most powerful aspects of this teaching. It suggests that true leadership isn't about titles or positions at all. It's about the impact you have through service. Whether you're a teacher helping students learn, a nurse caring for patients, or a parent raising children, you are exhibiting real leadership qualities.
So, in essence, we're all potential leaders in our own spheres of influence.
Precisely. And here's what's really interesting. The hadith also warns against actively seeking leadership positions. There's this profound understanding that those who desperately want power are often the least suited to wield it responsibly.
That reminds me of something I read about psychological studies on power, how it can actually reduce empathy and increase self-focused behavior unless there's a strong ethical framework in place.
You know, that's exactly why this principle is so important today. We're living in an era where leadership is often equated with celebrity status, social media followers, or the size of your office. But true leadership has always been about impact and service.
How do you think this principle could transform our current institutions if it were widely adopted?
Well, imagine workplaces where managers focused on removing obstacles for their teams instead of just giving orders, or political systems where leaders viewed their positions as opportunities for service rather than personal gain. So the research suggests this would lead to more innovation, higher engagement, and stronger communities.
That's fascinating. And it seems like this approach creates a different kind of authority too, doesn't it? More based on respect and trust than fear and compliance.
Absolutely right. And here's what's really powerful. When leaders serve their people, it creates this positive feedback loop. People naturally want to support and follow someone who genuinely has their best interest at heart.
You know what I find particularly relevant? How this applies to everyday situations. Like, Even in small group projects or family dynamics, this principle can completely change the outcome.
And that's really the beauty of it. This isn't just some lofty philosophical idea, it's a practical approach that anyone can implement today in any situation where they have the opportunity to serve others.
Do you think there are any potential challenges or downsides to this approach?
Well, it definitely requires more effort and sacrifice than traditional top down leadership. You have to be willing to put others' needs before your own, which isn't always easy. But the long term benefits, both for the leader and those they serve, far outweigh the challenges.
That's such an important point about sacrifice. It reminds me of how the most respected leaders throughout history often led lives of relative simplicity, focused on service rather than personal luxury.
Looking toward the future, I think we're going to see more emphasis on this style of leadership, especially as younger generations demand more authentic, purpose driven leadership in their workplaces and communities. And
So, what would you say is the key takeaway for someone wanting to develop these leadership qualities?
I think it comes down to this: start by asking, how can I serve, rather than how can I lead? Because paradoxically, that's exactly what makes someone a true leader.